So much louder. My wife would like to have a mute switch for me. So, I'm going to be talking about amateur radio, ham radio, but I'm also going to jump in at the very end and talk a little bit about a stock market update. S&P 500 hit a record high today. I love money, so I can't not take a chance to talk about that. This is a no tinfoil hat presentation, though, whether it be economics or ham radio. I am not a apocalyptic person. I'm very optimistic about the future and everything. I don't worry about putting my radios in garbage cans to protect them from electromagnetic pulses or any of that kind of stuff. Jack's phrase is times get tough or even if they don't. I like to look at that as if times get tough and having fun if they don't. And so I use my ham radio for emergencies. I live in an area where we're prone to getting a lot of wildfires. There's occasionally some flooding. There's a chance for a big earthquake someday. And so there's a lot of people that are using ham radios to prepare for that, particularly when the wildfires come. So that's a kind of a practical use for it. But I also use it just on a daily basis or at least a weekly basis for fun activities. And then that way, if I know how to use my equipment, I'll be prepared when there's an emergency. And that's kind of really the essence of the one point I want to make about amateur radio is that it's a hobby, but it's also a service. The reason the government licenses us and radio operators and the frequencies to operate on is because it is a service. We agree to provide emergency backup service anytime there's an emergency. You live in areas where there's flooding or hurricanes or whatever, you know that. And so we agree to do that, and as a result of that, the government gives us certain spectrums of wavelength to use. And we'll talk a little bit about those. But so it's both a hobby and a service. And as far as what it is, it's sort of like saying you play sports. People say, well, what do you do with ham radio? Well, it's like sports, right? Is it croquet or basketball? There's all kinds of different elements of ham radio. I'm going to talk about a really narrow part of it, but literally, I mean, it's everything from people using it for weather things with weather balloons and people talking to the satellites or bouncing their signals off the moon to the 100-year-old tradition of Morse code is still alive and well. So it's really everything that's happened in communications over the last 100 years piled into a big hobby, and people use all aspects of it. The great part about that is because people are using it daily as a hobby, whenever there's an emergency, there's always somebody already on. And that's the key part. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So the first question I always get is not the right question, but the first question I always get is, which radio should I buy? And that's like asking me, how do I invest $1,000? I tell you, you don't invest $1,000, you save $1,000. So you really shouldn't think about your radio first, but since everybody asked me that, that's what we're going to talk about. And the point I'm going to tell you is you probably shouldn't buy ham radio. Probably the first thing you shouldn't do, like I tell you, you shouldn't invest $1,000, you shouldn't buy ham radio. For most people, there's a lot of other radios out there that probably fit your needs. They're not ham radio. For the most part, other than one of these, you don't need to get a license for it. And so it fits into most people's agendas better. So let's talk about some of these things. Family radio service, you see these radios at Walmart and everywhere. They're not great communicators, but they work depending upon what you want to use them for. You don't need a license. They have 14 channels. You can do different squelch type things with them to get a little bit of privacy. They're FM, so you get good, clear communication. You're only using half a watt, so the battery power lasts a pretty good long time. You can't do anything with that antenna. It's a little teeny antenna. We'll talk about antennas in a minute here, but the biggest limitation is that stupid little antenna that's on there. And by law, if you have that kind of radio, you can't put an external antenna or change that antenna. So you're stuck with that stupid little antenna stuff. As a result of that, you can scream a lot farther than that will transmit. So if you're going to go to Disneyland or something, or be in a very open, small area, and you want to communicate with your kids, these are not bad. Okay, but they're better options. They're the cheapest option that's out there. That's the family radio service. Next best option up. I guess before we get to that, before I talk about immersion things, the reason that you're limited in all these radios is that radio signals travel line of sight. Okay, when we talk about antennas, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But line of sight means that if there's a big mountain between you and who you want to talk to, or a steel building or a dense forest or whatever, you don't have line of sight, and so those radios won't work unless you're doing something else with them, which we'll talk about. But you're really limited. You'll see in the box, you know, these are good for 50 miles. Well, they're 50 miles if you're standing on 2 mountains in Utah. There's nothing in between. But if you're like in Jack's area here, you'd be hard pressed to talk to them on the other side of his property. So that's as far as the family service one. Now, as far as the next step up is the MERS, the multi-use radio service. You only get 5 channels, but again, this is something that you're just using for your family. There are not necessarily a lot of people on these. They do have, again, squelch type things where you can just hear the people that you want to talk to. They're FM, so you get good quality sound. You're up to 2 watts now, so you got a lot more power. You can put an external or any other kind of antenna on there, so that's really a big advantage. That's going to get you farther communication, or farther distance, and you don't need a license to operate them. So if you're going out 4-wheeling with your buddies, or you're at your hunting camp, or on your homestead, this could be a good communication. If you want to set some kind of communication up between your house and your barn, something like that. This is something that's cheap and easy, and it's really reliable. Next thing is the old CB radio. They're still really functional. If you don't talk like a sailor with a real foul mouth, you can listen and learn all those languages on there too. This is the advantage of talking to the truckers. You can pick up quite a vocabulary. But there's 40 channels out there. They're up to 4 watts. You can put on an external antenna. You're dealing with an AM frequency now, so it's not quite the quality of an FM, but that AM signal will actually transfer farther. And in fact, they'll also allow you to use single sideband. We'll talk about that in a minute. That will really make your signal go farther. You can, if weather conditions are right, you can skip with these and talk all around the world. For the most part, though, on a highway, you're going to be limited to that 1 or 2 mile radius around you on the highway. That's a real big point, though. If you're going to be on the highway, they're still good to have in your car, carrying the trunk or something in case there's an emergency. You can always find a trucker on channel 19 if you're broke down and you need assistance. But again, if you're just going out 4-wheeling with your friends or whatever, you want to talk on your property, you got 40 channels, and they go a good long way, and you can tweak those antennas to make them work for what you need. Again, you don't need a license. Now, this is a unique version of all this, and these are the, I guess we're calling them GMERS now, or whatever. It's the general mobile radio service, and these are really the commercial radios, okay? But you don't have to be a commercial business to own one. You can just go buy one. They're up to 50 watts. You get a license, but you don't have to take a test. You just buy the license, $90 a year. You can use them with repeaters. You can put all kinds of antennas on them and beams, and you have 15 channels. It's good high quality FM. This is essentially all the people you see with the little Baofeng and Baofeng radios. This is using the same type frequencies at 50 watts, and so it's a really good radio. And you don't have to take a test to get it. So it's, in my opinion, if you again have a homestead, you want to communicate over your property, 50 watts will go a long, long way, particularly if you have a high enough antenna. You can really cover a big, piece of land, hunting track or whatever. Get it, don't get the license on it. It doesn't bother me how you do that, but you're supposedly required to have a license. But for a little bit of money, you're covered for 5 years and you don't have to take a test. Man, if I want to just communicate with my friends or family and not get hassled with ham radio tests, that's what I'd buy.
I think the one license also covers like.
Yeah, there's multiple. I think it's like a household type license. Yeah, it's a household type license.
Are each of these exclusive to themselves? So if you're on MERS, you can't talk to people.
Yeah. Or I think that's the next slide. Sorry, maybe not. Yes, they're all exclusive to themselves. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So that gets the ham radio, amateur radio. Why would you want to do that? There are all these other uses. Well, again, like I said, the amateur radio is a service, right? It is actually an emergency service that the government uses from your emergency communication. And even in the 21st century, it still is a big part. It's not as important as it was, during the Cold War days and in prior years, but it still is an important part of a lot of FEMA, Red Cross, and a lot of different agencies. It's part of their backup communication plans. And because of that, the government has given us this huge spectrum. So you can go everything from just about AM radio type frequencies you listen to your car, about that wavelength, all the way up to lasers, the frequency of light. Those allocations have been given to ham radio operators. We occasionally lose them over the years as telecommunications and different things want them. But we've got this huge spectrum, so you can use all those. You're not limited to what kind of antenna you can use, or different modes. You can use Morse code or voice or digital or packet radio. Just about any type of radio method can be used within ham radio. You can't encrypt. That's kind of the big thing. You can't use it for business, and you can't encrypt your data. As long as it's open, and you're not talking specifically about business, let me tell you about my podcast. Now, so you're not talking about business, you can use them for anything. You can use them to control your model airplane or your weather balloon or whatever. So it's a wide open thing. And instead of those little rinky-dink 3 watts or 4 watts, you can use up to 1,500 watts if you have the highest, level license. So tons of power. Okay, now the disadvantage is you do have to take a test. There's 3 levels of proficiency. The cost is minimal. It's like $15 for the license for 10 years. So it's not even for the license. It's, I guess, for the test is the big fee. But you do have to take the test. I would tell you, if you're interested in this, it's more than just the communication part. And the test is probably worth studying for because you'll learn things about electronics and how things work. And when we go out later today, if you want to come out, I'm going to talk about some things about circuits and things. And it's just a really valuable skill, I think, to have. So I'm not a big government guy. I don't like them making us take tests, but I think it makes sense. And as far as all this stuff, I don't have time to go into all the millions of terminology and specifics to the radio, but a couple of the big things you're going to have to need to know is about antennas and about the different modes. And just to make it simple on the modes, you already know AM and FM, right? Because of radios. You work your radio in your car. Modes can be not only AM and FM, but they can be digital, they can be voice, they can be Morse code, they can be all these different things. The mode is really just how you're encoding the data. And so, for example, with AM and FM, like you're familiar with, you have some kind of way, you have information and you're encoding it in some kind of a signal. This is an analog signal, it could be a data signal. Because you're talking on a radio, you're merging that with some kind of a carrier wave, some kind of an intermittent frequency, and then you modulate it to broadcast it. And so with AM, we keep the frequencies the same, right? But we're changing the amplitude of it, the magnitude of the volume. So you get AM, amplitude modulation. You don't get the quality of the sound when you listen to music with AM radio because you're always screwing with the amplitude of it. So it's not as good quality as you would with FM, which is frequency modulation. You're modulating the frequency, but your ears can only distinguish between certain frequencies. So it sounds better. And so you get better quality with FM, frequency modulation, than you do with AM, amplitude modulation. So just a quick example of how these different modes work. When we get into CB radio and amateur radio, we also use single sideband. You heard me mention that before. You could use that on CB radio. Single sideband is just a variation of AM, but like the name implies, it's single. So with AM, you have the full spectrum, right? You have like a sine wave. And when you use single sideband, you're cutting either the upper or the lower part of it off. So you have upper sideband in this case, or lower sideband if you were just going to use the bottom part. When you do that, again, you reduce the quality of the information, right? Because your bandwidth is now smaller. You're not hearing all the fidelity and all the peaks and waves. You're just hearing a portion of it. So it's not as good quality. You wouldn't want to listen to music over this, but for communicating voice, it works just fine. The big reason you do this, though, is now if you're using 100 watts to communicate all of this info, it's not going to go as far as if you take that same 100 watts and now only communicate half of it. So that's why single sideband can go farther, can propagate farther than the full spectrum. And we do these little tricks with all these different modes. That's why when you use digital or even Morse code, you can get your signal to go a whole lot farther because your bandwidth is reduced. On a Morse code, I think it's 700 hertz. You can imagine how small 700 hertz is. That's all that DIT is. And so if you're taking 100 watts and packing it in that little 700 hertz, you can send that thing really far. And so that's why we use these different things. And again, the band plan for radio, goes all the way up from visible light on down, and ham radio has a bunch of those portions of the band. If you have a Baofeng, or you're in that thing that's in the VHF, UHF, 2 meters, 70 centimeters, that's in this portion of it. I like to live over here in what's called high frequency, and that's sort of similar to AM radio bands. It's a little bit above that. So to get to, I think, Sean's question about, do all these radios work with each other? So MERS doesn't. There's some crossover on some of them maybe, but for the most part, they all don't talk to each other. But even on ham radio, although with ham radio there's more continuity, it's still, they don't all communicate. This radio or your little Baofeng is not going to talk to this radio. Okay, even though they're both ham radio, they're not going to talk to each other. And in fact, this one isn't going to talk to anything I have up here, because this is totally digital and these are all analog. So it all comes down to, when people ask me what radio should I buy, my answer is always, who do you want to talk to? Because what you want to do is, this is one exception to the rule I would always tell my kids is, don't do what your friends do. This is when you want to do what your friends do. Find out what your friends are talking on, and that's what you want to buy. Talk on that, because if you buy a radio that doesn't work with what they're talking on, whether it's the mode or the frequency, it isn't going to work. So find out who you want to talk to first, and then do what they do. That's the only time you want to use peer pressure. Now, as far as radio waves, this is really the most important part of everything. This is the big question to ask, not about the radio, but how does it all work? Radio waves, as I mentioned, they travel in a straight line, but the way we use that to our advantage is they bounce, or they reflect. Think about a prism, how it bends the light wave. Well, we can do that with different things, either in nature or man-made, to bend radio waves so they can work for what we want them to be used on. And the reason for that is, I say, well, why would you want to bend it? If you have a radio like this, it's working on FM or your Baofeng, it's a really high frequency, as we call it UHF or VHF, is ultra high frequency or very high frequency. And what that means is that even though it has a little antenna, it has a very high frequency, and that high frequency has a lot of power. And when it goes up into outer space, it doesn't bounce off the clouds of the atmosphere. It just keeps going. Okay, it's not reflecting off of anything. It's line of sight, so it's going to go between me and John here. We can see each other. If he's somewhere where I can't see him, he's not going to get my signal. It can't go through a steel building or anything like that. It'll just hit that and get absorbed and won't go anywhere. But if it doesn't hit anything like space, it'll go all the way up, and you could talk to the moon, or you could talk to the space station, or all those kind of things on a little radio, something similar to this, because those waves keep going. They just go forever into outer space. But that's a problem if you want to talk to somebody in Europe on a radio, because Europe isn't in space, right? It's on the other side of the Earth. So how do you get there? Well, you get there by bouncing things. And so other parts of ham radio that use different frequency, longer wave frequencies, or what I like to play in is that high frequency range, those waves get bent by the atmosphere, the ionosphere, or different things. I'm going to show you examples where we're bouncing off the ionosphere, but I mentioned talking about to the moon. There are people that use frequencies that bounce off the moon. It's called EME, Earth, Moon, Earth. So you bounce a signal off the moon, and you talk to somebody on the other side of the Earth that's seeing that same moon. You can bounce it off of cloud thunderstorms or different cloud scatter. Some people try and bounce off of airplanes to do local communication. If you see an airplane going by, you can bounce to him and hit somebody from here. You talk to somebody in Dallas, bouncing off the airplane. So there's all kinds of crazy ways to do these things, but the most common that we use in high frequency is to bounce off the ionosphere. And so what your signal does, if it's at high frequency, it goes up into space. If it's the ultra high frequency, if it's just a high frequency, it hits the ionosphere and it comes back down to Earth. The skip distance varies. You can think of it generally about 500 miles is a good thing to think about. So it'll go up and it'll bounce down to 500 miles. And you say, well, how am I going to talk to Europe from Texas? Because Europe's a lot farther than 500 miles. Well, the great part about propagation is that it bounces more than one time. And so you could be here in this example in San Francisco, and if you're using the right frequency and the right angle of takeoff, it's going to hit the atmosphere at different levels and come down, and maybe it bounces down here in Kansas, and then it goes back up over Chicago and comes down, it hits New York, and then bounces across the ocean a few times, and you hit Paris. And that's literally the way it works. And sounds real convoluted, but it's fun. This is the part of the hobby that I really enjoy, because I like figuring out that how the atmosphere in my antenna, the antenna is going to give me the angle of takeoff, and then the atmosphere, whether it's summer, winter, day, night, what frequency I use, that determines how many times you bounce. Sort of like playing pool for nerds. Right? It's like bouncing things up. So that's what I find fascinating about the hobby. And it's that bounce that makes all the difference. And so when you come back to these Baofeng radios and you say, or the small handheld radios, you say, well, how, I know these will talk farther than just a few feet if you're using a repeater. And that's the difference on these small radios, is that we put repeaters either up on top of buildings in cities or on the top of mountains if you live out west like I do. And we can talk on this small little antenna up to the repeater, and the repeater will rebroadcast us to someone else on the other side of the mountain or the other side of the city. And in fact, nowadays, these repeaters are all linked to each other, either line of sight, like in Utah, there might be a mountain that has a repeater on it, and it can talk to a mountain in Nevada, just line of sight, because they can see each other. And they're also now all tied into the internet. And so, you can literally, on this radio, I don't have it hooked up right now, but I could have this hooked up so that I talked to a repeater in my trailer that got on Jack's internet. Okay, this would be digital. It's a digital signal to my computer through a router into Jack's Wi-Fi internet. Would get rebroadcast to stations that are listening on the internet, and then the app in the radio would also repick it up, and it would come back to me through the repeater, through Jack's Wi-Fi, back to my radio. It can get really convoluted, but that's the fun of it. Again, you're mixing 100-year-old technology with modern-day technology, and you can do all kinds of crazy things in between. So you can literally talk really all the way around the world on those little radios if they're hooked up right. In an emergency, though, if all that stuff goes down, right, then you're back to this. You're back to the 100 watts in a wire type antenna. And when a lot of times on Jack's show, I'll talk about QRP. QRP is just a term for low power. And so a little radio like this has low power. This radio is 100 watts. This radio is maybe 4 watts. And unlike the little Baofeng type radios, these 4 watts are in high frequency. And so I can't use a little teeny antenna. I have to use a big long wire antenna. Or with the 2 of these, and this has its own battery, an own lithium battery in it, I can string this up in a tree just about anywhere in the world, and I can put out an emergency signal using Morse code. And again, that's why I like Morse code, because that, if you know Morse code, that little, since you're using such a small amount of bandwidth, you don't need a big power transmitter to get your signal out. And because it's a hobby where people are on there 24/7, someone's going to hear me, right? If I put out an emergency call on a frequency that no one ever used, no one would hear me. But if I put out an emergency call where a bunch of guys are gabbing, they know to stop that and listen to the emergency traffic, and they repeat that, and that's what they're trained to do. Listen, they're out there just fooling around, doing whatever they do for their hobby. But when they hear the emergency signal, they stop and they find out what's going on, and then they repeat that, and they either repeat it between each other to get the communication to where it needs to be, or they get on the internet or phone calls. If you listen to hurricane nets or different things during disasters, you'll hear exactly that going on. People say, hey, this is a message to someone's family in from Tupelo, Mississippi to Chicago. Call these family up, tell them their loved ones are safe. And those are the kind of messages they handle, as well as the big critical things of, hey, we need supplies, we need water, we need sleeping bags, we need shelter.
When I used to be a ham radio in high school, we had a tanker blow up in Waverly, Tennessee. Some of you might remember it. 12 people died. They cleared the whole town out. I got to go into the command center with civil defense, state police, local police, EMS, and we had a ham radio network, and that's what we were doing. We were like saying, where'd so-and-so get evacuated to? He's at the National Guard, and get that information back and forth. It's pretty fascinating.
It's amazing. Again, with the high technology now, we can use packet radio and different things to not only talk, but to send data. And if you're interested in that, your local town or community probably has a CERT team. You can join that and get involved. And there's a lot of different ham radio as well as non-ham radio volunteer things you can do. Getting back to the radios, though, the other part of it is a lot of people say, well, what QRP radio should I buy? And I tell them, well, have you ever been in ham radio before? It's kind of, again, like investing $1,000. People say, hey, should I buy real estate? Well, do you ever make money on real estate before? Maybe you should think about it before you get into it. You shouldn't run out and buy. If you've never been in ham radio before, you probably shouldn't buy one of these, because in this case, you need to know Morse code, and it's You know, it's 4 watts, and it's not necessarily going to talk around the world unless you know how to use it. What I tell people to do is, if you want to get beyond the Baofeng, you probably want to get a high frequency radio that puts out at least 100 watts. And the price differential, something like this is probably going to cost you $200 to $300. This has no bells and whistles. You want to get one of these with bells and whistles, they're $2,000. But for a couple $100, you get something like this. You can get this for $600 new. You can get them cheaper used. But for $600, this gives you full spectrum of digital, voice, Morse code, whatever you want to do. You know, where this one's limited to Morse code, a few bands and only 4 watts. This is 100 watts and does almost everything ham radio does. AM, FM, everything. Okay, it doesn't do the ultra high frequency stuff, but anything in high frequency, this radio will do. It is heavier, it is bigger, but it's not, right? Not that much. I wouldn't necessarily want to go backpacking with this, but it is doable. And if you really want to get started in radio, I'd start with that, and you combine that with a LiPo 4 battery, like Sean had mentioned. This little thing weighs, I don't know, maybe 2 pounds, pound and a half. You put these two together out in the field, you wouldn't want to use 100 watts because it would drain your battery pretty quick. But remember, this little one's only using 4 watts. You can turn the power down on this. You don't have to use it at 100. You can use it at 5 watts or 10 or 75. So you can make a little battery like this go a long way with this kind of a radio. So for people that are just getting started, I say go for the 100 watt small compact mobile radio. It covers all high frequency. And you can mount it in your car. You can use it as a base station in your house. You can get a LiPo battery and take it out in the field. That's really, I think, the best route to go. And other than the radio, the only other thing that really matters is, and the thing that really is more important than the radio, is the antenna. That's what I want to talk about next. And to keep it really simple, everything comes down to wavelengths. Okay, wavelengths relate to the length of the antenna that you need, and it comes down to the speed of light. You don't have to be Einstein to figure this out. Okay, it's simply the speed of light is equal to the wavelength times the frequency. Okay, the speed of light is 300 meters per second. And so you divide 300 meters per second either by the frequency or by the wavelength to get the other. And so in our case, the reason it's important is because your antenna needs to be a factor of the wavelength. And in general, it's a quarter. A quarter wavelength is a good antenna size. So when you see a CB radio in the old days, sees people running around, they had antennas on their car about 8 or 9 feet, a big stainless steel whip antenna, old police cars. That's because a quarter wave of 11 meters, which is what CB operates on, is about 9 feet or so, right? That's a quarter wave. So if you know the frequency you want to operate on, you divide it by 4, and that's about how long your antenna should be, generally, right? There's a lot of other factors going into it, but that's a rule of thumb. That's the easiest way to think about it. So a radio that's similar to this, it would operate on 2 meters, which would be what your typical Baofeng is going to do. That would be about 144 megahertz. So 300 divided by 144 gives you the 2. That's the 2 meters. You divide that by 4, you get about half a meter, and that comes out to what, about 19, 20 inches, right? When you buy a Baofeng, it has a little teeny stub antenna on it, right? And remember I said those little family service radios, they're even smaller. They're like this big. Well, this big isn't 20 inches, is it? That's why those radios don't work with a crap, and they don't let you they don't let you change that on those family frequency ones. On the Baofengs, you can buy longer antennas. You can put a longer antenna. This one is base loaded, so it isn't a full 20 inches, but it's pretty darn close. And so this is going to work much better. You can take a radio with that stupid little antenna on it, put a longer one on, and you'll drastically improve your performance just by increasing the antenna. And so think about it. Quarter wave, when you see these advertisements, you know, tell you all this stuff, it doesn't matter. If it's not a quarter wave or some multiple of a quarter wave, you're skewing things, and you have to have other components in there, like loading coils is a huge example of a loading coil, but that antenna, little bitty thing, has to have a bunch of little coils in it to compensate for that little, that small amount of wire, and that's a trade-off that makes it not work as efficiently. So
are you saying that that maybe if you extended the coils in there, it would be the quarter length? It's just,
well, they're manufacturing the quarter wave. Since they have such a small physical wave, they're using capacitors and inductors to make it electronically seem like a longer antenna. And that works, but it doesn't work as well as the real thing, right? And that's why when I'm working on high frequency, I'm not using a little bitty stub antenna. I've got this. If you look out there, go outside, I've got 135 feet of wire out. It could be 2 quarter waves or 3 quarter waves or 4 quarter waves. It has to be a multiple of a quarter wave. And so that 135 feet is a half a wave on 80 meters. It's a full wave on 40 meters. It's two times
20.
on 20, right? All the way up. So I can use it on all these different frequencies on my radio. I can use one antenna, and that's the trick. But it has to be some multiple of that quarter wave, or you have to trick the radio into thinking of a different antenna. You do that with capacitors and inductors. This is a coil and inductor. The caveat to that is if it's other than a quarter wave, you have to add some kind of a transformer. And you see in the base of my antenna here, I have a little ferrite core that's wrapped with wire to make a transformer. I'll tell you about that tonight over no duels if you really care. But what's important to know about that is when you go to Home Depot and you buy coaxial cable, it's probably about a 75 ohm coaxial cable at Home Depot. That's because that's what you use for the stuff in your house, the video and the Cat 5 wires and stuff. In ham radio, we use 50 ohm coaxial cable. And that all comes down to, at a quarter wavelength, the impedance where you're tying into that antenna is 50 ohms. If you go to a full wavelength or half wavelength or 3/4 of a wavelength, it's not 50 ohms anymore. And you need a transformer in there to step it up or step it down to match it. It's kind of like trying to drink out of a fire hose with a straw. Right? You have to match. You have to match the intake and the outtake
You have to
together.
put your mouth on the fire hose.
Yeah, you can't just put your mouth on the fire hose, right? So you have to match it somehow. So that's the trick about the antennas. But it all comes down to that quarter wave. Some other things we don't have time to talk about now, but again, pull up. I know duels out there tonight. I'm gonna be out here with the radio. We're gonna try and talk to some other TSP guys around the country. They've said they want to try and make a contact with us. So we're gonna try to use the radio and do that. I also have a few little circuits out there, little breadboards. This is keto-free bread. It's a breadboard. You use it to build circuits with. And if you don't know about parallel or series circuits or resistors or that stuff, we can play around with some of this stuff and give you some kind of indication of that. Stuff is really good to know the basics of, because it's sort of like knowing how to start a fire, right? If you can start a fire with flint and steel or with some kind of friction device, then if you have a Bic lighter, you can really start a good fire. So I like learning the basics, and then it helps you understand other things. We're going to do that. We can do that tonight if anybody's interested. So that's those things we'll talk about. Real quick about money. How much time do I have?
You've got
18 minutes.
18. Yeah.
18 minutes of joy. Stock market.
Show us the money.
Show me the money. Let me hear it.
Woo, show me the money.
I am optimistic. I know a lot of I'm a prepper. I used to tell Jack I was a prepper before prepping was cool, right? I was raised with grandparents that were, my grandfather was born in 1883, okay? So you hear about people that survived the Great Depression. My grandfather survived everything. He thought the Great Depression was a cakewalk compared to all the crap he put up with before that point in his life. So I'm prepared. I'm not paranoid, right? I think we live in the most absolute best times to be on the face of the earth, because the opportunities are immense. We got governments and bureaucrats and all kinds of other people that are trying to put barriers in our way, but we're smart enough to get around it, right? So I'm optimistic about the future. I'm not a paranoid prepper. I'm not a tinfoil hat guy. I look at the reality of it, and then whether it's ham radio or whatever, making money, I look for the opportunity. And right now, everybody's complaining about politics. If the election's stolen or whatever, of course the Democrats cheat. Like, that's who would have thought, right? We know to expect that stuff. I was born when President Kennedy took office. A month or two after he took office, I was born. I don't remember President Kennedy. Yeah, it's too little. I don't have that good of a memory. But I remember LBJ and everybody since Kennedy, right? The whole parade of marionettes that were in the White House. And some were better than others. Some were real morons. But you know what? The country survived and we thrived. And we had space shots and men on the moon and the Cold War and the end of the Cold War and the internet and computers and telecommunications. And we had riots and we had assassinations and Martin Luther King getting killed and
9/11.
John Kennedy getting killed, 9/11, Robert Kennedy getting assassinated. People say how bad
Epstein.
Epstein didn't kill himself.
Yeah.
He voted. Epstein voted.
I'm sure he voted.
3 times.
He probably voted for Clinton.
All the things that we look at going bad today and talk about rioting and all this stuff, right? Listen, I remember as a kid, I don't remember if it was weekly, but there were times monthly when I was a kid in elementary school where we would get evacuated because someone called a bomb threat for the Vietnam War, right? I remember JFK getting assassinated. I remember Nixon, Ford attempted assassination, Reagan attempted assassination, Martin Luther King assassination. I remember all these things.
Nuclear drill.
It's always been bad, right? There were always things that are bad. There's always protesters. There's always violence. So I don't worry about this stuff. And of late in the last decades or so, I worry even less, and this is convoluted, you guys may not agree with me. I worry less because I don't care about who's in the White House. I know who's in the Federal Reserve, right? I know who our real president is. It's Chairman Jerome Powell. That's the guy that matters. It doesn't matter if it's Biden or, Trump or Pence or Harris or any of them. It's this guy. This guy's printing right now today $120 billion a month. Billion dollars, 120. That's beyond anything we did during quantitative easing 1, 2, and 3. 120 billion a month. GDP wise, that's probably like the state of Nebraska, Kansas, maybe District of Columbia, those kind of size entities is what their annual GDP is. So we're creating like a Nevada every month. Think of all the business that goes on in Nevada, how big their GDP is. This guy's printing that much money every month. And yeah, you can take the negative side of that and say we're going to have inflation and this and that. I take kind of the opposite side and say, like, what can go wrong? Sure, it's bad, but they're not letting any companies go bankrupt. And that may change someday, but for now, they're keeping the system flowing. S&P 500 hit a record high today. I can't change all the stuff that these clowns do, right? I can't. I can loose the goose and I can eat brownies and different things, right? But I can't change anything. But I know that these guys, I know they're going to do what they do, right? And so I try and figure out how to profit from it. And what's in place now is not changing. Okay, I'll show you some conventional charts here. Pre-election, this top one is going back to August 3rd, the 10-year treasury hit its low point from COVID. It's the lowest in history, just right around 0.5%. 10-year treasury hit 0.5%. It had been low all year long with COVID, but that was like unbelievably low, lowest in all-time history. And since then, it's been rising, and we're getting back up to close to 1%. And even that is historically insane. We've never been consistently this low. But we did hit a low point, right? And that's all I care about as an investor. I'm seeing a change in trend. From March, from February really, to here, it was nothing but down. In August 3rd, long before we knew the outcome of this election, which we still don't even really know now, the Treasury, the smart money, knew things were starting to improve. It was getting better. I combine that with looking at the value stocks versus the tech stocks. And this is actually small cap, but they're a good analogy for what I'm trying to show, a good placeholder. All during COVID, a lot of the tech stocks and the stay-at-home stocks did really well, right? So Zoom and Peloton, and then the associated tech stocks, Microsoft, Google, even Tesla, they all did really well. It was kind of considered they got a boost from COVID. But starting, and everything else fell apart. Banks, and energy companies, entertainment, hospitality, any of that stuff that was non-stay-at-home totally fell apart. bottomed in March and started to improve. Tech took off in April and just went all year long. But again, that was August. Here in September, the beginning of September, his black chart is technology. His red chart, in our case, is small caps. I'm using it to represent value stocks. Value stocks from September on have outperformed tech for the last 3 months.
Russell 2000 hit an
All-time record high today, right. These trends were in place before we knew the outcome of the election, right?
Yeah.
It's already in place. And that's basically because we know COVID's fading. And that's the bottom line. COVID's going away, one way or the other. It's not stage 4 cancer. It's a virus. We overreacted. It should have never gotten as bad as it did, but the markets fell apart and they hit bottom. And not necessarily the stock market, because the stock market will do this all day long, right? It's going to vacillate up and down over its real value. But these kind of indicators, particularly the interest rates, are much more stable. So when you see them hit a bottom and recovering, and you see values starting to, small caps starting to outperform the tech sector, you know there's a shift in trend. And so, again, why I'm optimistic is that means that the market's going to keep going up. And oh, by the way, they're printing $120 billion every month. That money has to go somewhere. Okay, it's going into real estate, it's going into the stock market. Depending upon if what Biden ends up doing, it's going to go into infrastructure. The price of copper, I didn't check the price of copper today, but yesterday it was at like $3.15, $3.16, $3.15, 316 cents a pound. That puts it pretty much where Trump was when he got reelected, or when he got elected. The copper price had come down. Once Trump got elected, and through his first year, copper skyrocketed. So we're back to getting back to 5-year highs in copper. Again, copper's in everything, right? Copper's in building supplies, it's in electronics. When you talk about infrastructure, you're talking about copper. Gold and silver, but gold in particular, will go up and down based on inflation and fear. Copper goes up and down based on the economy. Rule of thumb. So we're seeing copper improve. We're seeing interest rates improve. We're seeing value stocks starting to outperform these stay-at-home and tech stocks. And so my theory was this was a time for me to jump in, because I'd been out of the market all summer. Early on, I remember Jack was calling for a depression. He was really worried about certain things happening over the summer. I was a 50-50 guy. So look, it's a coin toss. I'm going to sell 50% of what I own. Mostly sold, kind of did the opposite of what you generally should do. I sold my flowers and kept my weeds, right? I kept the things that were underperforming, and I sold my top performers because I thought they were hitting all-time record highs. I sold my Amazon. I sold, those type stocks. I got out of them. And then I was in cash all summer long. And just recently, a couple of weeks before the election, I went into 90 stocks. So I took the COVID-19 and changed it into COVID-90 because it's my 90 stock portfolio. And to give you an idea of what that would represent, if I take all those 90 stocks and I look at their average performance this year, like everything, they collapsed in March. They started to get better. They fell apart in June. And then they just stagnated. We hit a double bottom from May till September. There was a double bottom, and then just months and months of stagnation. I call that consolidation. Things are consolidating. And, stock prices can only do one of three things, right? They go up, they go down, they stay the same. That's all they can do. It's that simple. Joke. It's that simple, though, right? They can only do one of three things. Obviously, this can go down and go worse. But generally, when you have that much consolidation, you're saying that there's a floor here, there's support. And I think that's what we have. And so that's when I got in and bought these. And what I'm looking at is picking up that differential. If you look at the average price here to where they were performing before the COVID hit, that's roughly almost 40%. It's not quite 40%. So I looked at that as being a really good opportunity to have low risk, because I'm spreading it over 90 different stocks over a wide variety of sectors. And I'm saying if they can just get back to where they were, not including any growth beyond that, but if they can just get back to where they were pre-COVID, you're looking at roughly a 40% increase, right? So is that going to happen in 3 months, in the spring? Is it going to happen next summer, 6 months from now? Is that going to happen in 2 years? I don't know. I'm looking at it. I say I'm willing to take that risk. I think it's very low risk. And if I can get 40% the next 3 months, I'll buy another radio, right? If if I can get 40% over the next 2 years, you know what? It's like cheese. I'll still be happy, right? If I can get a 20% annualized rate of return on my money over 2 years, and get 40%, I'm happy, right? I got to build my wealth not by taking big risks, by taking calculated risk over time. And if you do something long enough and have the discipline, that's how it works. You don't get rich quick, but you get rich slowly. And so I think this is an opportunity. I was worried about getting in during these periods. I'm not worried anymore. I don't care who's president. Jerome Powell's got our back. Again, I say that tongue in cheek. I'm not happy about it. I'm just telling you the way it is. And so the stocks that I bought, they're all out of my website. You don't need a decoder ring. You don't need to subscribe to anything. It's all free. You'll see what I bought. It's free advice, or it's worth what you're paying for it. No guarantees. But I bought stocks across the board, and I avoided the big money sinks like Delta Airlines or Caribbean Cruise Lines, because lots of stuff there, right? Lots of things that they're probably going to be fine, but still lots of things that can go wrong. I tried to, not everywhere, but I tried to find areas that I thought could really benefit from the rise in hospitality, like Yelp and TripAdvisor and Airbnb hasn't come out on an IPO yet.
They're working on it.
Eventbrite, I think, was up 14% today. Things like that they can hire and fire people at will. I mean, they're just an app, basically, right? They don't have all the infrastructure and all the money sink that Caribbean Cruise Lines would have. So I looked at a lot of areas like that. I did buy some hotels like Marriott and Hyatt. A lot of things related to aerospace that weren't specifically, more like manufacturing companies that support that area, because they do other things. They're not just, they had enough business to keep them afloat. And then once the airlines come back on, I think they're going to do really well. So those things are all out there. Again, I'm not pessimistic. I think I wish I was as young as all you guys, because the future's bright. So don't let all the negativity get you down. Find your niche, find your opportunity, and we are living in the best times in human history. So with that said, I don't know if I have time for questions, but at 5:30 I'll be out at the trailer, that little pavilion out there, and I have the radio set up. We'll call ham radio things and show you operation, and we'll talk about some circuits as well. Any questions? Yes, sir. May I help? My crystal ball, yeah, if you listen to my podcast, my podcast, you'll hear me, I don't say I don't have a crystal ball anymore. I still can't predict the future, though. When I was in Tennessee, these guys presented me, Tactical and Nighthawk presented me with a crystal ball. It's still cloudy. Still cloudy.
We gotta work on that.
I'm looking for balls on a brass monkey next.
Only 2 crystal balls.
The radio should talk about I have a ship to shore radio on my boat. Where does that fall in?
Yeah, I think that's UHF.
Okay.
It's like, so aircraft frequencies are AM, and that's the mode. I don't know the frequency. Those would be more like this kind of a radio in the UHF thing. Good radios, and again, you're at sea, so they're gonna talk like 18 miles because that's the curvature of the earth.
Yeah.
For good radios, and you pay for a license, you take a test, you pay for a license.
Yeah, you can. Because it has that emergency.
Is it a civil penalty if you do the ham without a license?
Yeah, there's a fine and things. No one's gonna fine you if you use it for an emergency, right? If you're just on there fooling around, you could get a fine. I mean, I don't know how many people get fined a year. But it's more of a self-policing thing. Ham radios don't want people that aren't licensed on there. But if you use an emergency, no one's going to put you in jail. And so if you know how to use it and you use it during an emergency, but the problem with these little bail things that everybody buys, and again, this is not one, but I'm using this similar to it. There's millions of those bail things sold, right? Most people don't know how to use them. And when there's an emergency, they're all going to turn them on. And if they do figure out how to use them, they start hitting all the repeaters. The guys that own the repeaters are just going to change the codes and wipe everybody out. So I don't know how good those bail things are. I mean, the good part about stepping up and getting a license is you meet other people. It's kind of like a fraternity. You get a lot of knowledge. You figure out how to use stuff. And if you're using it in peacetime, right, then you know how to use it in wartime.
You can own and receive without a license.
Absolutely. It's just transmit.
Transmits
the part you need a license for.
I've got.
So when you figure out Thursday evening in mid-October at 5 p.m. when it's cloudy, how to talk to some lady in Paris.
And what kind of sunspot cycle you're in.
Okay. Is it always, did you figure out a formula? Is it always the same when those conditions are that, or is it changed, like, for some reason you have to figure it out every time?
Yeah, there's all kinds of formulas,
So,
but
it's
they're
always
like
different.
they're like stock algorithms. They don't always work.
That's why you like
That's why I like it. I like to turn the radio and figure out what's going on. What you do know though is when you try it, you get feedback to where you know whether it's working or not, and so you can adjust your frequency. And that's why we have 80 meters and 40 meters and 20 meters. So and the angle of your antenna you can figure out, because you can't change the weather condition. You can change your frequency and you can change your angle of
So
takeoff.
some things be the same that you can.
Right. And so like right now, if we go out there, we're gonna get on 20 meters because it's daylight. It's winter time, may not work as well, or getting towards winter.
But getting close to evening.
And getting close to evening, the gray line, but we're gonna try 20 meters. If 20 meters doesn't work, if we run too late in the evening, I'll go to 40 meters because 40 meters works better at night than 20 does. Generally, right? Generally.
Isn't the technician license pretty limited in high frequency?
Yeah, almost none. You can use, I think, some CW stuff in 40 meters. The technician license is basically going to let you use UHF, VHF on a Baofeng type radio.
Are you saying
And
that,
there's also a very easy test to pass.
did they not, when I was in office, we had 80, 40. They took,
Yeah, they took
it
that
away.
away.
Oh
Yeah.
my
And
God.
I think you got a
11 meters.
Morse code on like
15? You did that?
I don't know. I only know 40 meters at like 7.15 to 7.12 or something. It's a small little. See, but they made it easier to get the license. Though.
Yeah.
So that's
You don't even have code now, do you?
no code. There's no code. And that's the weird part about it. So I didn't get into ham radio as a kid because I could never pass the code test. As an adult, once they got rid of the code test, I got my ham radio license. And since then, I've been spending all these years trying to learn code because I'm fascinated by the
What's your
Morse
call
code.
sign?
The call sign is N7PUG.
Ah.
N7 Pug.
Vanity call.
Worth it.
How can you test if your signal is making it to like Europe or somewhere specifically? Like,
Yeah.
do you depend on somebody being there?
Well,
Boy, you get talking to
you
somebody.
could. That's the old way of doing it, right? And that's again the beauty of mixing the 100-year-old technology with the new stuff. I show these guys today. Earlier today, I sent out a call sign on 3 different frequencies. I just banged out my N7PUG, right? And then I brought up reversebeacon.net, and I put in my call sign, and it told me all the stations out there that heard me. So other people have digital radios that they're receiving my signal that can pick up that N7PUG, and they'll put the time, basically a signal report, right online, and I can look that up.
They
And
don't
that's
have to
fast. And that's a simple way. There's all kinds of ways to do it now. I was telling these guys too that there's a thing called a whisper frequency or whisper network where you can just put out milliamps, just teeny, no low, super low power, and it goes through with the encoding process. I don't know what's the error, that error thing, where it looks for an error.
A CRC.
A CRC, where it's looking at it, it adds up the number to know if it's got your full message or not. And what it'll do is it'll take that digital digital signal, and maybe it takes 8 hours to get the whole thing, but it'll tell you when your signal goes through, and you're just doing that on a teeny little bit. So it's showing you that propagation is amazing, and these signals, even on fractions of watts, can go all around the world. They just don't all get there at one time. That's the problem.
Is that a website where you can find if they?
Yeah, if you Google Whisper, it's an acronym. Amateur Radio Whisper. You'll find out more about that. And that's all done with digital.
John, to answer your question on HF for technician license, 40 meter and 15 meter is Morse code. That's all you can do. And there's just this little sliver in 10 meters at 28 megahertz that you could actually do voice communication on. Very small amount.
So remember, I told you about quarter. I forgot to mention too on the quarter wavelength. You want, on this kind of radio, you want something about 18 inches, 19 inches. On 20 meters, and somewhere between that radio and up to 20 meters, what do? Well, you get a telescopic antenna that goes out, right?
Yeah.
And you get one that just goes out to 16 feet. Believe it or not, they make that kind of stuff, right? So this will go out to 16 feet because size matters. So this antenna could talk on frequencies from that all the way up to a 20 meters simply by adjusting the height of the antenna. And you can tell that by whether your power is getting on in your radio or not. If you're at the right, there's obviously all kinds of ways you test it, but one way is if your power is
leaving
leaving the radio, you know your tune, just like a guitar. You musicians in here, you know when your finger's in the right part when you're strumming there. You're resonant on that frequency.
And if you got it wrong, then it's going back into your radio.
It's going back into your radio, and that's why you'll see my little lights come on when I key my mic. If I'm not exactly right, it turns the lights on in my trailer.
So it's absorbing the.
It's absorbing and kicking it back through the wiring of my.
Could blow up your radio.
They're all protected now.
Oh, okay.
The circuits, but like the
Back in the day, they
the antenna wires transmitting, and then the extension cord and all that stuff I have out there is an antenna, right? So it'll receive all that and it'll blink the lights in my trailer.
One of the things that was said a while ago is if you don't have a license, you can listen and receive. That's not technically true. You have the opportunity to listen and receive. If you don't have your stuff set up right, you're not going to hear squat.
Okay, thank you, John. Nope, yeah, Jasmine. So we're moving into the breakout session. There are several there. It is time to clean